think we're ready to get going. All right, well, welcome everybody. Appreciate everybody who took the time to participate today in our webinar. As you all know, this is going to be pertaining to reserve studies, and our guest speaker is Mark Wiseman with Tangible Properties. Just a couple of notes before I turn it over to Mark. If you could just make sure you're on mute during the regular part of the webinar. At the end, once Mark's done with his presentation, we'll open it up to questions and comments and everything from everybody who's on the call. So, and then also once Mark shares his screen, I would just recommend for view, you could pick speaker view is probably the best option in the top right corner of your screen. So just as a recommendation there. All right, so with that, I'll turn everything over to Mark.
All right, thank you, Mike and Sarah. And thanks everybody for attending this morning, for joining us. And thanks to White and Katzman for doing these seminars and for inviting me today. Hopefully this is going to be of value to you. I am sharing my screen here. And I hope everybody can see the first slide.
Looks good.
So reserve studies, which really the technical name for a reserve study is a long-range capital funding and reserve plan. And what I hope to cover for you this morning is the what, the why, the who, the how of reserve studies, and then get into a little more detail. What are the elements within the reserve study? Talk a little bit about philosophies and methodologies, because there's a lot of choices to be made as you set money aside for the future, and how to use a reserve study once you have it. And there should be plenty of time for questions at the end. So question number one, what is a reserve study? And in the simplest of terms, it's a plan that just looks at all your major repairs and replacements of the common elements that your association is responsible for. And it blends not only the cost of these items, but the timing of them. You know, when are these things most likely going to happen? But I want to take a step back from this and really examine, you know, what are reserves? Okay, because everybody's got a different opinion of what reserves are. And if you look at, this is a very common conception of reserves, that you have your yearly budget. You've got monies in there for operations and maintenance, you know, your snow plowing and your lawn mowing and your insurances and your property manager. And then you set aside some money for reserves, for things that need to be repaired, maybe. And then what happens many times is that, oh boy, we had a lot more snow plowing this year than we thought, and we had to dip into our reserves to pay for some of these operations. So this is a very simplistic view of, you know, your pot of money in any given year. And I really want to enlighten you to look at this a little differently and define these reserves in a much healthier fashion. And that's taking the same yearly budget, and you have your operations and maintenance. But, you know, reserves are defined by two things. Reserves are all these capital projects that you intend on doing in that given year, plus some kind of contingency for that. So we'll get into these details a little bit more. So when you look at what is a reserve study, well, it's dealing with those two items. It's dealing with the monies that you want to set aside to accomplish your capital projects and a contingency, because we're not going to think of every single capital project. They're not going to all be as estimated, either time-wise or money-wise. But over a 20 to 30 year period, we try, and your reserve study tries to identify everything that's going to happen in that time period. So that's the reserve study portion of your budget. It's not covering your operations and maintenance. All right, so why do this? Why have a reserve study? Well, as we just saw, it's so that you can repair and replace your common elements. That's the number one thing. When you have a reserve study in hand, you have documented your intentions to maintain the property. Boards change personnel quite often. So there's no reason why this needs to be reinvented every time your board turns over. So there's continuity here in your planning. This is a long-range document. It will continue to serve you for a long period of time. And once you know as a guideline what you're going to put into reserves, it helps establish your monthly fees. Your contribution to reserves should not be arbitrary. It should be based on exactly what I showed you before, which are your capital projects that are anticipated and some kind of defined contingency. And we'll talk more about that as well. So who is this important to? Well, number one, it's important to all of you residents who plan on living there for an extended period of time. You want to know what the future is going to bring for you financially. You want to know that the property value is going to be maintained. Similarly, for residents who want to sell, and that ties right in with buyers and those who are selling. You want to be able to tell your buyers, and they want to know that you are well managed financially. There are no surprises, that there's not going to be a massive assessment the year after they buy. So those are a couple more of the who's. Your board members, your board of directors, they have the responsibility on their shoulders to maintain the property, keep it safe, and put a budget together every year. And your property manager is in the same business. So this is a big help to your property manager to look at all these projects that are coming and organize them and anticipate when they might be coming. Outside people, like I mentioned, the buyers, banks and finance companies, when people look for mortgages, they want to know that you are financially stable. And same thing with your insurance carriers. They want to know you have the funds to take care and maintain the property. All right, so the how is all this done? Well, there's a few steps involved. Number one is identifying the common elements. What is the association responsible for? What are their quantities? We look at their estimated remaining useful life, which means what condition are they in? When's the last time they were replaced? What do these elements normally, how long do they normally last? And that gets estimated a little more finely in terms of replacement costs. And then we look at how you're funding your reserves at the moment and fold in all that information above and come out with a plan, a funding model for the future that usually covers at least 20 years. And in some cases will go 30 years, probably more for newer associations, new construction. It makes more sense to go longer than 20 years. Now, a lot of people involved in forming the plan. So your long-range funding plan, certainly your board of directors are involved, along with any members of the association that have historical knowledge of the property. There's always somebody who's been there since the beginning. They may still be on the board. They're probably a past board member, and very valuable information about when the last time things were done or specific problems about your property. Property managers are involved. I work with them very closely for historical documents on when things have been replaced. Many places have an on-site super. You at least have some vendors that I would talk to that know about your repairs and what's been done. And of course, your reserve analyst will assemble this whole thing all together. In my case, I'm an architect. I also work with a builder and estimator to get reliable cost estimates on things. But reserve analysts come in all different sizes and shapes. But that's where it all starts, and that's where it all ends with your reserve analyst. So this is according to the AICPA, American Institute of CPAs, and what they say reserve studies should include. And it's very similar. It's, as what I just told you, it's identification and analysis of all the major components, estimates of the remaining useful lives, estimates to replace them, the cost to do that, some kind of cash flow projection that shows how all that folds in between 20 and 30 years. And then number 5 is a little more detailed. Number 5 is a funding goal. All right, so they list 4 different ways of establishing your funding goal. A component full funding, first one, is the most conservative approach. And it says that, I'll give you an example. If you're going to replace a roof this year, and it's going to last 20 years, then in the following year, you would put into your reserve 1/20th of that value. And that would be true for every single component that makes up your association. It tends to be, like I said, very conservative. It raises what you put into your reserves more than any of the other funding goal methodologies here. So it's rarely used. There are some states that mandate it, and we'll talk about that a little later. But most times it's some version of the following: threshold funding or baseline funding, which are very related to each other. Threshold funding just says that, okay, here's what we anticipate spending over the next 20 years. And we're going to make sure that any given year after we've spent money on these projects, we're going to still have a balance, a contingency, if you will, a threshold value. And we're never going to let that go below that threshold amount. The baseline funding is the same thing. It just says that that threshold value is 0. In other words, you're okay with, all right, it's okay if we spend all our reserves this year, as long as we know we'll be raising enough for the following years as they come. I've never seen anybody do that. I don't recommend it. It's really a contingentless plan. And the bottom one, statutory funding, just says, well, whatever the law says, that's what we're going to do with our reserves, and nothing more, nothing less than that. So staying with this description from the AICPA, I've enhanced it a little bit with what I think you really need in here beyond this bare minimum. So besides just identifying each major component, you really want to quantify them. You want to know how many square feet of this, how many square yards of that. I think that's important for the future. With your estimates of the remaining useful lives of these things, it's fine to say this is going to last another 10 years, but I think you want to document the age of what's there and the condition of things. You want that in your written report. Item 3, with the costs, the estimated costs to replace things, you want to see it in today's dollars. And then you want to estimate a year of when it's going to be replaced and assign some kind of inflationary factor to it. But the starting point would be today's dollars. Things are a mess right now in terms of construction costs. I've seen I've seen articles saying that it's as high as 20% over the last year and a half or so. So it's crazy time to be spending money on these projects. And item 4, cash flow projection should include any earned interest that you have on your reserves as well. And number 5, as I said, yearly projects. Very nice to not just say when these things are going to happen, but create a schedule of yearly projects that have these escalated costs in there. And I'll show you an example of one of those. This is from a recently completed complicated reserve study. It happened to have multiple separate budgets. Those are the columns that are located here. Most condominiums will have one consolidated budget. But this is an example of what I think a reserve study should have as one of the most valuable tools in it is projects by year. So in 2022, for instance, here's all the anticipated projects that the association will probably be spending money on, which budgets and they're coming out of. And then as you go, this list would go on for 20 years and show you all the projects over a 20-year period with the inflated values plugged in. Another chart, another tool in this toolbox in your reserve study is a cash flow. This is your funding plan. This shows year by year how you get from what you have in reserves, what you plan on adding to reserves this year, what you're going to earn in interest, and all the projects that you probably will be performing in that year, and then the end balance for that year. And that will roll through the 20 or 30 years and show you, here's your plan. Here's what's suggested to add to reserves every single year. So that plan we just looked at there, in terms of the big picture over a 20-year window, the fees, monthly fees, and what it was currently in the reserves accounted for 75% of all the project costs over 20 years. So this particular example had a 20-year total of $16.5 million. It's an escalated figure, taking into account a factor for cost escalation over the years of construction. So of that $16.5 million that will be spent, most likely will be spent on these projects and replacements, 75% was being raised through monthly fees. 1% of it was raised through interest on the reserves, and 24% was through special assessments or loans. So every reserve study results in a funding plan. There are a myriad of funding plans. How you set aside reserves, how much you're going to set aside, will change the shape of these pie pieces. So something to work through with your reserve analyst. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So we saw this slide, elements of the reserve study, these 4 ways of looking at your funding goal. They're really funding methodologies, as I explained. What is the methodology that you would like to use? What are you comfortable with in establishing the needs of your reserves? So you would work with your reserve analyst and and walk through these options. I got to say that 95% or more of reserve studies end up with a threshold funding because it tends to be the most realistic. It's safe. You're putting enough away to handle your projects, as opposed to the full funding methodology. There are some associations out there that want to go a more conservative route and do that, but usually a threshold funding makes the most amount of sense to send you in the right direction. In terms of statutory requirements, I think if you look down the bottom of this slide, it says there is no statutory requirement to conduct a reserve study in Connecticut, okay? The language above talks about other things that are recommended with budgets. By the way, these slides will be available to everybody. So you can get this, a copy of all this in PDF. But, you know, there's some recommendations that Connecticut has, but it does not say you must have a reserve study. When you look across the country, it's only the blue states here that have a reserve study requirement. All the purple ones are similar to Connecticut, saying, well, it's a good idea. You know, it's a good idea to have one. The green states make no mention of it at all. There's nothing. So we looked at these methodologies. But what you have to consider when you're looking at those at the same time are really a philosophy for reserves and what you are asking people to pay monthly. How do you feel about loans or special assessments? A lot of associations will say we've never had one and we never will. They're rare. There are many others, most that at some point it's required. You know, you just haven't collected enough in reserves. You have a big project coming up, no choice. You've got to take out a loan or assign special assessments to your owners. In my view, I think a reasonable amount of loans or special assessments makes sense. It's ensuring, really, it's proof that your fees were not too high. I mean, the last thing you want to do is overtax your membership. You know, you want to make sure that, you know, you're not collecting too little or too much, but a modest amount of loans or special assessments that are predicted and predictable are okay to some extent in my book. And again, you know, you're aiming over the years for consistency and predictability. You want to know what you can expect your fees to be, at least the reserve and project portion of your fees. I mean, I think in a perfect world, you would be putting X amount into reserves this year, and then you would be increasing that every year by the rate of inflation, period. And that's predictable, it makes sense. If you can get your association into that kind of situation, I think everybody would be happy with that. As long as, you know, when I say get yourself into that situation, show that it makes sense, that you're not resulting in too little or too much being collected. You want a sense of fairness in what you put into reserves so that all your members pay their fair share. Everybody enjoys a new roof for a long period of time, not just the people who are there the year that it happens to need to be re-roofed. And of course, I mentioned before the board, your board members have fiduciary responsibilities. So all these philosophies, these factors roll into how you choose a methodology for your study. So if we go back to a reserve study being capital projects and a contingency, what that really means is that just rewording that a little bit, you know, that contingency is that funding goal. In other words, what is that bare minimum you're willing to live with at the end of a year without bringing it to zero? And that relates to those methodologies. So your reserve contribution in any given year becomes a factor of what are the projects and what is that minimum goal at the end of the year that you want to hold on to. So a very wise person, a client one time said that, you know, this reserve study, if you imagine your condominium like a cruise ship and you're trying to get across the ocean, you can't see the destination. Nobody knows what's out there 20 years from now. But you want to make sure you're on the right course. And that's what reserve studies are all about, to show you and guide you. You're good. You're on the right track for that 20-year period. But you're going to make course corrections every once in a while. You're going to check and see where you're at. Most importantly, when you look at your reserve study and you use it, it has a list of projects in there that are expected, but it's not a mandate to do the projects as they're listed. You're going to do them when they need to be done. You're not going to repave before you need to repave. You're not going to replace a roof well before it's due. But you need to be ready when you want to do it. So it's a tool. It's a tool to be used when you're putting your yearly budget together. And as we saw before, it will guide you very easily into that reserve portion of your yearly budget, rather than an arbitrary amount, rather than, I know the FHA is looking for condominiums to set aside 10% of what they raise into reserves. And that's nothing more than an arbitrary amount. You can see it's a lot more complicated than that to figure when you look at all your projects and come up with a realistic number. So this becomes your friend as a tool every year when you do your budget. And over the years, you'll track, well, did we do this project? Did we not need to do the project? We did it, but it came in higher than we thought. So as you track those things, you'll come back and update the reserve study. And I see time periods of approximately 4 to 7 years making some sense. Again, it depends on how many changes are made in the projections for the future in there. And some associations can wait longer, and some should do it a little sooner than 4 years. So it depends how drastically things change. The way the market is right now, with the cost of construction, it's a circus. It's just a crazy circus out there. And even before the pandemic, construction costs were going up at a little higher rate. For a couple of decades, it kind of averaged 3%, 4% a year, somewhere in that range for a construction cost escalation. But from 2013 roughly to just pre-pandemic, it was closer to 5% a year for construction costs per year. And then in the past year and a half, I've seen numbers from 17.5% to 20% for construction cost escalation. It's pretty scary, So with that, I would love to take your questions. I will stop sharing the screen so that some faces can be seen. And Mike and Sarah, I will turn it back to you.
Great. So I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anyone does have any questions, you can either raise your virtual hand or submit it in the chat. However, okay, we do have one here. How much should a reserve study cost?
Generally, I'd say most studies fall in the $3,000 to $4,000 range, but there's a lot of conditions. How many common elements do you have? How complicated is the things that you own? Do you have a clubhouse and a pool and a tennis court and irrigation systems? And so the list can go on and on. It will vary. There are some extreme cases. I did, let's see, Heritage Village in Southbury, 2,500 units. I don't think anybody sitting here has 2,500 units. So, that certainly did not fall within that $3,000 to $4,000 range. But generally that's where most of these fall.
I had a quick question for you too about what about the updates? Because I know, after a few years, some communities want to update their reserve study. what's the average cost for updating an existing study that you guys have already done?
You probably figure something on the order of 2/3 of the original cost.
Okay.
Half to 2/3, somewhere in there. Again, it depends how many things have changed from the initial plan. But yeah, if you figure 2/3 of the original cost, that would be a safe placeholder.
Mhm.
We have another question here about preparing this year's budget and adjusting for inflation rates. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions there?
Well, if you have numbers from a year or two ago for construction projects, you're probably going to have to add 10, 15, 20%, on those numbers. You're really going to have to go out there and price things, which you would do anyways. But the other factor is timing. A lot of materials are very hard to get. It just takes a long time to get things. The supply chain is slower and just less quantity materials out there, which means when a contractor can get a material, they're probably hoarding it, which makes it a vicious cycle because now it's more expensive for everybody else and harder to get for everybody else. So you're really just going to have to stay with it, work with your property manager, and price things out and sit down when the numbers come in. There's nothing we can do about it. Hopefully the market will correct itself over the next few years. It's rare that anything goes down in cost, like taxes and your fees. Nothing seems to go down, but maybe the rate that construction cost is increasing will slow. That's the best. I think that's the best that we can hope for right now, or at least it will eventually catch up to where it would have been over a period of time. Not a happy answer, but.
All right, great. Does anybody, yeah, Dave, go ahead.
Sure, we're currently having a reserve study right now. So we're up at the reservoirs, and we have 179 units where we have a number of standalone homes, and we have 4 buildings of 108 folks. So we usually do a reserve study about every 5 years. So we did it in 2008, 13, and 18. And we would have had it done next year, but we moved it up a year because of all the different changes in inflation and the economy and so forth. So, and this goes back to the question as to how much a reserve study costs. We're paying a little over $8,000 to get it done. And so we're fortunate in that we have 3 separate budgets depending on what we have. We have a separate budget for all the folks that live in the 4 buildings, because there's a great deal of reserve activity that goes. Have a budget for the standalone homes, which the association doesn't really offer a great deal in amenities, and we also have common things that whether it be the street lights, the streets, and this sort of thing. So so we're basically looking for the report that will come pretty soon, but it was over $8,000, and we think we're pretty good with what we're reserving and everything, but we'll find out a little more in the very near future.
Well, it sounds like you're on top of it, doing the right thing there, and that's a good example, similar to what I had shown earlier, of a multi-budget community, and then you assume that you use those 3 pockets to establish fees for each individual, depending which part they're in and what they partake of. Yeah.
All right, do we have any other questions? No? All right, well then, thank you everybody for attending. If anything does come to mind, you can always send an email, and we have recorded this so we can share it with everybody as well. So if there's nothing else, thank you very much, Mark, for your time and the presentation today. I think you covered everything. And thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike and Sarah.